SCOTUS/the Voting Rights Act, what that means for midterm elections, and Connecticut's congressional map. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. The Supreme Court recently issued a major ruling on Louisiana's congressional map. In a 6-3 decision, the justices said the state relied too heavily on race when drawing its congressional districts. The ruling undermines a key portion of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, a landmark piece of civil rights legislation. And it could potentially reduce the number of majority black districts in the state from 2 to 1. But the decision is expected to have implications far beyond Louisiana. Already, other states are rushing to redraw their congressional maps, raising the specter of a new era of partisan gerrymandering that critics say undermines decades of racial progress. This hour, we'll look at what this ruling could mean for the upcoming midterm elections. And joining me now is Alec Hernández, national politics reporter at Politico. Alec, thank you so much for being here.
Frankie, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So great to have you. I want to have folks give us a call today if they'd like to talk about this and help us understand what they might see as the implications for civil rights under the SCOTUS decision. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Just a couple of weeks ago, Alec, the Supreme Court issued a major ruling in Louisiana versus Calais. At a high level, what did the court decide?
Yeah, that's right. So as you were laying out there in your intro, the court ruled in a 6-3 ruling, basically along partisan lines here with the conservative majority ruling against Louisiana's maps. But as you pointed out, what the case was about was the second congressional district or one of two congressional districts in Louisiana that had been drawn to be majority-minority seats. So what you had in this particular case was a group of litigants challenged the makeup of that seat. They described themselves as non-African American voters in the district. The case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what they were asking for was for the court essentially to rule that the creation of that seat was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Act. And that's essentially what the court ended up ruling. That ruling was authored by conservative Justice Samuel Alito. And essentially what he ended up saying was that, yes, it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. So in the immediate, it, of course, entirely changed Louisiana's congressional districts. But at the era time, what it really ends up being a question about is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Amendment, which is sort of one of the last standing pillars of the landmark civil rights era legislation. And what that means essentially is for a long time, federal courts interpreted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to essentially mean that racial data, racial characteristics can be taken into account when drawing a congressional district, right? But what Alito has done here is essentially say that he's changed the standard. Now, not only is the bar changed for what constitutes the racial data that you can use, but it really severely limited the cases that states can use to use race in drawing their congressional districts. So now, based on this new Alito precedent, what a state will need to prove in order to draw these majority-minority districts is that, prior to that, the maps, prior to creating that majority-minority district would have to be, they'd have to prove a significant amount of racial discrimination that has to be untethered from partisanship. But the issue that you run into in states, particularly in the South, is a lot of these majority-minority districts are voting mostly for Democrats in a lot of cases. So it's really difficult to extricate those two things, which essentially undoes Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It really raises the bar so high that it's almost impossible to use now.
The case centers on the Voting Rights Act, as you just mentioned. Can you remind us when the law was passed and what problem it was originally designed to solve?
Yeah, so it was passed back in 1965 at the height of the civil rights movement. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And essentially, at the height of the civil rights movement, you had the protests at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You had these major sort of moments in the civil rights movement that spurred Congress and President Johnson to act to, basically create new equity for minority voters to cast a ballot, right? You had things in the South like literacy tests or poll taxes, which disproportionately affected voters of color from voting. So essentially what the Voting Rights Act was doing at the time was leveling the playing field. It was helping Black voters, brown voters access the ballot. And that's been in place for decades. And now it's been significantly changed. Section 5, which was another sort of key pillar to the act, that was dismantled under the Obama administration. And now you have Section 2 that basically is a dead letter. So the Voting Rights Act in all but name no longer exists.
Wow. That's quite something for 61 years of existence here and what it was designed to do. But some dissenting justices on this ruling, what were their concerns about the decision? I know Alito was a big proponent of turning this down. Yeah,
so Elena Kagan wrote the dissent for the minority here, right. And she delivered her dissent from the bench, which is a signal among, sort of like Supreme Court watchers of supreme dissatisfaction with the ruling of the majority. And essentially her concerns were that by limiting Section 2 here, or making it basically an impossible statute to prove, it undoes the Voting Rights Act. So her concerns were essentially that what you're doing here is not only making a ruling that's specific to Louisiana, but it makes the Voting Rights Act basically what they call a dead letter. The law no longer has teeth to it and its original intent.
And that's, you said more than just Louisiana. So in her dissenting opinion, Elena Kagan really spelling it out for all of us, saying that this goes beyond Louisiana. So could you help us understand a little bit more of this national perspective and what we should all be paying attention to here?
Yeah, so what you're seeing already is starting to play out. So I think first what we have to do here is back up a little bit to before this case really came before us. President Trump was already moving to push Republican-led states to redistrict ahead of the midterms and sort of help bolster, Republican numbers in Congress. You saw that his sort of the first domino to fall was in Texas, and it kept falling from there, right? You had North Carolina also move their maps and draw in more of a Republican majority. So there was already a push from the White House and from President Trump personally to have these Republican states redistrict. But because the Voting Rights Act was in place, a lot of the southern states, a lot of the Republican-led southern states were unable to redraw their map. But what you've seen now is essentially an opening of the floodgates that's allowing a lot of these southern states that previously couldn't touch their maps to redistrict in favor of Republicans. And you have to remember that a lot of these states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama have Republican supermajorities and Republican governors. So it's very easy for them to sort of move these maps along. But the concern that, Democrats are seeing and that Justice Kagan pointed to in her dissent is already playing out. Immediately after the ruling, you had Tennessee eliminate their sole Democratic district that was sort of based in Memphis. You've seen the state legislature basically already cut that seat up, divide Shelby County, which is home to Memphis, into 3 different congressional districts, which is diluting, critics are saying is diluting, Black political power in Tennessee. And that movement, sort of those dominoes keep falling in the South. Louisiana, just last night, they're in the process of passing their new map. They're striking down one of their, or they're erasing essentially one of their Democratic districts, and they're going to keep just one instead. South Carolina, a measure fell through yesterday to redistrict, but it's still, they're still on a path to draw out, the powerful Representative James Clyburn, who's been in that seat for decades. And Alabama, all these states in the Southeast essentially are now able to look at these maps, redraw them, and give, Republicans quite an advantage heading into November.
Let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Louisiana's governor, Jeff Landry, announced that he was going to redraw the congressional maps and therefore suspend the House primaries, which were set for May 16th as a result of this Louisiana versus Calais ruling. 6th District currently led by Democratic Congressman Cleo Fields. He spoke with ABC News about the suspension of the congressional primaries. He says the Supreme Court decision and the reaction that followed from Louisiana officials was out of line. Here's a clip.
Not to mention the fact over 100,000 people have received early voting ballots. Many of them are military people overseas, elderly people who live in Louisiana. They have already cast their ballots. And for the governor and the secretary of state to halt the election in the middle of voting, disenfranchised thousands of voters in Louisiana.
So you could look at it as him saying that something more nefarious is happening here, or at least at a surface level say that, hey, we're already trying to get the franchise process here going, and it's being interrupted at this point.
Well, really, Louisiana, obviously at the center of this case, you're seeing them, because they're mandated here by the court to redraw their maps. You're seeing essentially the most amount of chaos, for lack of a better word, in the state. As the representative mentioned there, their primaries are scheduled for this Saturday, but the governor had to declare what he called a state of emergency to postpone the congressional the congressional primaries in the state. So now those are happening at a later time. Meanwhile, primaries for local office for the all important Senate race are happening. They're going ahead on Saturday to begin with, but Louisiana hasn't even agreed on a map yet, and we're deep into primary season here, and that's of course leaving voters confused as to what they're voting for and when. But it also, in an important election year, it begs the question of whether there's going to be enough time to even, get make sure that folks have the opportunity to vote here. And, Louisiana officials say they will. They're hammering out those details now. But really the case, Louisiana versus Cali here has really upended the primary season in Louisiana. And you're seeing some of that chaos too, like I mentioned, in these other Southern Republican states.
Is that chaos the big concern? What are officials and voters there most concerned about right now? You heard them talking about the impact on voters.
Yeah. So you have, a lot of course, folks in the Black community who are, as the representative mentioned, they're afraid of disenfranchisement, right? Of losing their voice, their longtime voices in Congress. And that's, of course, a concern. But the logistical chaos here is definitely notable. Louisiana is still trying to push through the details of how they're going to vote. And their, primary was supposed to be in 3 days. So to be sort of building the plane as you're flying it here really presents a particular challenge to Louisiana, but these other states were trying to move forward with maps prior to the 2026 election.
Aren't these maps usually redrawn every 10 years in accordance with the census? So, why are states redrawing them now?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Usually it's done, we know what's called the reapportionment process, where the census is taken and then states are able to redraw their congressional maps based off of updated population data. But, this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with President Trump's pressure campaign. It's sort of unprecedented that a president would, ask Republican-led states or states, led by, governors in their own party to redraw these congressional maps in sort of an off year or like a mid-district or a mid-decade cycle. It's truly unprecedented, but there's also, at this point, particularly for states that don't have independent redistricting commissions and Republican supermajorities, there's nothing stopping them. And that's exactly what you're seeing here.
Are other states seeing similar disruptions to their elections? And has there been any notable pushback, I would say, either from voters, candidates for office, state officials, anything more remarkable? I know you've talked a lot about it here, but we've looked at Louisiana. What would you say? What would Alec Hernández say is a number 2 place to look at here?
Well, right now, South Carolina, I would say, is the next sort of interesting domino here. It's, of course, another Republican-led state. But yesterday, without getting too deep into the parliamentary rules of how the state house works there, essentially Republicans, 5 Republicans joined Democrats to tank a redistricting effort there in the short term. So now, you're going to see this White House pressure campaign really turn on South Carolina to push Republican Governor Henry McMaster to move this map along and eliminate their one congressional district there. But to your question about, the pushback that we've been seeing, I think, if you look to a state like Tennessee, when last week they were working through their congressional map, you saw just a really strong amount of protests from locals. A lot of folks in Memphis went to the State House in Nashville to make their voices heard and say, hey, you are disenfranchising not only the city of Memphis, but Black voters in particular. You saw Steve Cohen, the local representative there, show up to those protests as well. Even yesterday in South Carolina, which is a predominantly Republican state, you had protesters interrupt the Senate proceedings yesterday as they were getting ready to vote on this redistricting measure. But South Carolina, a domino that could potentially soon fall in this redistricting saga. Alabama is set to move forward, as well as a federal court there cleared the way for them to be able to redraw. And Louisiana, as we've been talking plenty about here, is sort of moving that ball along.
Are there any additional legal challenges expected?
Of course, but it's unclear sort of where, I'm not an attorney, but it's clear to me that, once the Supreme Court rules on something, it's very difficult to find legal recourse after the fact to be able to sort of change anything. Whether we'll see, litigation in, on a state by state cases when it comes, when these Republican legislatures put up their map and pass their individual maps, it's almost a guarantee that you're going to see legal challenges to those redraws. How far those challenges will go are to be determined. But to this point about chaos ahead of, the 2026 elections, litigation is only going to prolong this process here. And, the clock isn't going to stop, and elections are going to have to happen in November. So it really is going to muddy the waters here, the closer we get to not only these primary dates, but also to November.
So as we finish up here with the primaries kicking right around the corner, and these things now going into practice here. You talked about watching some of the things that were happening. You talked about Tennessee. You talked about South Carolina. Will you be paying in particular attention to the pressure from the Trump administration on these states, or the reaction from voters and potentially protesters? What should we be looking forward to, I guess, most?
Yeah, I would say it's important to pay close attention to who President Trump specifically, or, officials from the White House, who they're calling to sort of push the ball along here. To go back to South Carolina for a second, the Senate Majority Leader there, Senator Shane Massey, he's one of these 5 senators that voted against the redistricting measure yesterday. He's been personally called, he told reporters he's been personally called by President Trump twice to sort of move the ball along here. So what you're going to continue to see, which started even prior to this ruling, as we were talking about a couple minutes ago, is just a continued sustained pressure from the Trump administration in what's expected to be a pretty difficult midterm year for Republicans in the first place. You're going to keep seeing the White House, trying to push these Republican states along to help cushion the, what's expected to be a pretty difficult year for them. And Democrats seem very keen on retaking the House. They've got the sort of political waves, the political wind behind them. So this is an effort that Republicans can use to sort of help stave off what are expected to be some pretty significant losses for them.
A lot to watch for, and we should be paying attention in particular to Alec Hernández, who's reporting, national politics reporter at Politico. Alec, terrific job here at 9 a.m. Doing the hard work for us. I appreciate you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That's the national picture, and as we've heard, this ruling could reshape how voting maps are redrawn across the country and drawn up. But what does that actually mean here in Connecticut? When we come back, a closer look at how this decision could affect redistricting and voting rights in our state. Should Connecticut's congressional map change? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. The Supreme Court of the United States recently issued a major ruling that undercuts a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. It's a decision that could reshape how congressional maps are drawn across the country. So what does that mean for Connecticut and the state's congressional map? Joining me now, Bilal Sekou, Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Bilal, great to have you on here.
And go Hawks.
And go Bilal. Also with us, Kyle Evans, an assistant professor of mathematics at Assumption University. Kyle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So happy to have you on. And folks, make sure you give us a call if you'd like to talk about redistricting, what you'd like to see here in Connecticut, if at all, or what you're paying attention to nationally as well. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Let's kick it off with you, Bilal. What are your first thoughts on how the SCOTUS decision may impact us here on a state level, maybe even a regional level, or what?
Fortunately, Connecticut over the years has really done a lot to protect elections, to protect voting here in the state. The state passed a voting rights bill. They have worked over more than a decade to significantly expand, voting rights. I think the interesting question, of course, is around what impact this decision may have on how redistricting is done here in the state of Connecticut. I've always made the case that what Connecticut engages in is the protection of incumbents. So it's a kind of incumbent protection racket that occurs here in the state. So I'm not sure that this will have a huge impact here in Connecticut. It is a blue state, and you're not likely to see that change, at least in the short run.
You said there were state protections. Are you saying that they codified the Voting Rights Act here in Connecticut, right?
Yes, yes. So there was actually a state-level Voting Rights Act that was passed here in the state that was pushed.
Is that like in anticipation of something like this happening?
Well, I think in many ways it was a response to this sort of, I think, probably a trilogy of cases that have come out of the U.S. Supreme Court. Certainly the Shelby County case that also dealt with the Voting Rights Act and also this current case dealt with the vote. And these are different sections of the act. The Shelby County case, of course, dealt with this question of preclearance and the sort of rules around when states could change their voting laws. And so for a lot of advocates and elected officials and citizens in Connecticut, it was really important for the state of Connecticut to really take a stand in terms of its embrace and support of voting rights and trying to make the franchise accessible to as many Connecticut residents as possible.
You talked about Shelby County. I spoke with Alec Hernández there, as you heard. Mm-hmm. We've talked about South Carolina and Jim Clyburn serving 17 terms there, mm-hmm. And now his seat potentially being targeted. Yeah. Memphis, when we talk about Shelby County, I think about Dr. Martin Luther King and where he was killed.
Right.
And so this is a big place in terms of our American history. And you also have Alabama potentially being divvied up here. So the symbolism that takes place here, what are you thinking about when you hear about these places?
When I think about the Voting Rights Act along with the Civil Rights Act during that period, and we can probably throw in Hart-Celler as well as the Housing Act that occurred in 1968. This was a moment of real transformation of American society. I would make the case that, to claim that America was truly a democracy before the passage of the Voting Rights Act is just simply not wrong when so many people were being disenfranchised legally in this country. And the Voting Rights Act should not be looked at as solely as a tool for expanding voting rights for black people. It made America a democracy and protected the right to vote for all Americans. And so I think we need to view it in that sense. And I think what we're looking at now is an effort to really erase that presence of black lawmakers, in Congress, out of the South, that has many parallels to what we saw during the period of post-Reconstruction. And so I think we are in a very bad moment in our nation's history. I think in many ways this election is not just a referendum. The midterms will not just be a referendum on the president, but I think in many ways it's a referendum on white America. Will white Southerners really go along with something that is so blatantly racially motivated as what Republican lawmakers are doing and redrawing these districts and essentially diluting and trying to disenfranchise black voters, which I think harms the nation as a whole.
Powerful words from Bilal. I appreciate your perspective there. I'm going to bring Kyle Evans into the conversation. Let us talk about Connecticut now. Can you walk us through redistricting and how it actually works here in the state? We talked about the census. I would imagine that has some part of it in normal times.
Absolutely. So it all starts with the census every 10 years. And, it's worth reminding people that, even though the congressional districts get the most attention, we are really redrawing 3 different maps every 10 years on the state level, right? So we're talking about the congressional maps, which we know in Connecticut, we have 5 congressional districts. But we're also talking about our state government, right? So we're talking about our state Senate, which Connecticut has 36 districts. And we're talking about our state House of Representatives, which Connecticut has 151 districts. And so we do have a bipartisan committee formed by representatives. So it starts with what's called a reapportionment committee. And I think it's even worth mentioning, by the way, calling it a reapportionment committee is even a misnomer. I mean, reapportionment is the national process where, we use a mathematical formula to allocate the number of congressional seats in each of the states, right? That's different than redistricting. Right? Redistricting is the drawing process. Reapportionment is just how many seats there are. But in any case, so it starts with a reapportionment committee, which there were 8 members, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and they have a deadline of September 15th, the year after the census, to complete, or submit their maps and hopefully get passed.
So that's 2021 and 2031.
Correct, 2021. And they would need this to get passed by 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Now, in this last year, in 2021, this never happened because there were such delays in the census data due to COVID. So we never even got to be able to engage in step 1 of the process. Step 2 of the process is we just move and call it a different name, and it's called a reapportionment commission. And that has 9 members. It has 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 2 each from the state House and the state Senate. And 8 members collectively select a 9th member. And at this stage, the maps don't need to pass the state House or the state Senate. They simply just need to be passed by a majority of the 9 people in the commission. And this is in 2021, late 2021. They have a November 30th deadline, by the way. And this is where the state maps did pass in 2021. And, it's actually worth saying that, even though we have this committee or commission that are doing this, they're not the ones physically drawing the maps, right? We have legislative staffers associated with the party in power, Democratic Party in Connecticut, who are actually physically drawing these maps. And, in Connecticut, as Bilal mentioned, we do have a lot of incumbent protections built in these sort of behind-the-scenes, closed-door negotiations, where different representatives are trying to determine, where their lines can be drawn to, hopefully maybe maximize their chances of being reelected, regardless of party affiliation. And then the third step of that process, so like I said, step 2 is where the state-level maps did pass in 2021. The third step of the process is if the commission is not able to reach a conclusion, the Connecticut Supreme Court can decide to elect a special master.
There we go.
And this is what happened for Connecticut's congressional maps back in 2021, 2022. And we had selected Nate Persily, who was a professor at Stanford Law School. And he also actually redrew the Connecticut maps in 2012 in the same process. And he also redrew a bunch of other states recently too, New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. But he has definitely been the person in Connecticut the last 2 cycles.
What was the scuttlebutt there that made people disagree, or sort of it had to go to the special master in 21?
Yeah, I think it's just, again, it's political, right?
Sure.
Especially on the congressional level. I think the Republicans are just trying to make 2 of the 5 districts as competitive as possible, particularly District 5. And so, I think the Democrats just kind of played it out in a stalemate sort of a way. And the congressional map that ended up being passed was the literal minimal change map, where it was moving the minimum number of people just to satisfy the equal population across the 5 districts. And none of the towns that were split changed at all. It was literally just moving people around to satisfy equality.
Bilal, Connecticut tends to elect Democrats to Congress. As we said, this is a blue state. But to what extent does the map itself play a role in that?
Well, as he just described, they barely changed the maps, right? And so, and he can go into much more detail about the operation behind the scene in terms of the drawing of the district and taking a look at demographic and population movement and other sort of things. But, clearly, incumbents who are in office have a say in this decision. They're influencing this process, even though they like to keep it, as quiet as possible. And they're trying to protect, their districts. And as he suggested, in the past, there were a couple districts that were more competitive. The district that Himes is in used to be more competitive. Of course, we moved from 6 to 5. And also, in the time I've lived in Vernon, I've had Joe Courtney, I've had Republicans as well as Democrats who have represented that district. And it has now shifted to where Democrats are the ones who are winning on a consistent basis in the state. But there's no guarantee that that will last forever, obviously, because this used to be a Republican state. So these things do, in fact, change.
Or you could live on my street in Glastonbury where half of it is represented by Joe Courtney and the other half is represented by John Larson.
Right.
Given the Supreme Court ruling, I'm not necessarily asking you to delve into politics, but is there anything that we're seeing based on the Voting Rights Act that districts in Connecticut were drawn up in that fashion that might have to change or might get some kind of challenge in the future based on this ruling?
So we could talk about this on the congressional level or the state level. Sure. I'm going to say let's start with the congressional level. The difference really between Connecticut and a lot of the southern states that we're seeing being contested right now is, the majority minority populations are largely voting Democrat, and that is the winning coalition in terms of the Connecticut districts, which is not the case in a lot of the southern states. And so like Alec had mentioned earlier, we do often have a challenge of untangling this idea of partisan gerrymandering versus racial gerrymandering, but it's really a non-issue in terms of having the minority populations being able to elect candidates that best support or represent them, because they are part of the winning the candidates that are winning the districts in Connecticut. So I don't see an issue on the congressional level. Yeah.
And I think also language really matters. For years, I've used the term majority-minority district, but I think what they really are opportunity districts. They are an opportunity for people of color, for example, to elect representatives who descriptively share their sort of background, share their experiences. And, the thing about the South is that, and again, I think you're right, disentangling the sort of partisan and the racial sort of dimensions of this issue. But certainly what we do know is that most whites in the South are voting Republican. And to the extent that you see partisan gerrymandering occurring on a massive scale, it is paralleling those sort of racial patterns of voting. And so I think what's astonishing about this case in terms of the outcome of it is being able to make the argument, as long as you don't overtly describe this in racial terms. And in the past, there have been mistakes. North Carolina was an example where they talked about disenfranchising black and diluting black voters. Now people are very savvy. My understanding is in the debate that occurred in Tennessee, they were like, we had no thoughts about race. We weren't thinking anything about race and what we were doing. And so now they're savvy, smart enough to know that as long as they stay away from certain kind of language, they can essentially dilute the black vote in those states, divide up the districts and say, look, we're just doing this for partisan reasons. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about at the state level, drawing state level districts, because the way the demographics of the state have sort of changed over the years, the growth of the Latino population, certainly you're likely to see more demands by, for example, Latinos for greater representation because of their growing portion of the population, which may collide with some of the incumbent protection work that goes on with the redistricting. I mean, how does that sort of play out at the state level with some of these districts and how they're drawn?
Yeah, no, you're right in that the incumbents really drive the process. And, I'll say that in terms of the 151 districts in the state house, at least of the time of the census, I believe we had in the 30s in terms of how many of those districts were majority minority, and I think another 8 to 10 that were right on the border, 45 to 50%. And that is actually pretty reflective of our state population in Connecticut. I mean, we've got about 3.6 million people, and of that population, or at least of the voting age population, about 1/3 of them are of minority populations, and so that is actually almost exactly reflected in the breakdown of our the demographics within the 151 state house districts. But that's not necessarily reflected in the people who are representing them, right? And yeah, certainly the incumbents were driving the process. And in last time, of the 151, not a single district was drawn that paired two incumbents against each other. Not one, right? And one of my favorite examples, maybe favorite's not the right word here, but one of the best examples I think is in Manchester, where in districts 12 and 13, the two incumbents literally live a street across from each other, right? And you can guess where the line is drawn, right? And of course,
is that Rojas and Rockmont or Curry and I'm trying to think.
No,
Rojas and Curry.
No, he's in East Hartford.
Yeah. I'm losing my mind. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. So it's and keep in mind, in terms of the scale, right? When you take our 3.6 million people and divide it by 151. Each of these districts is only really 24,000 people, right? So you have a significant impact and regardless of the demographics, right? So it's going to be interesting to see, will this change? Is there more pressure, right? I mean, we definitely champion our bipartisan approach, but I certainly would ask the question, just because it's a bipartisan approach, does it necessarily mean it's fair and best for our voters in representing them by protecting incumbents? Yeah.
You've actually taught a course on redistricting. So what do you ask students to do in that class?
Yeah, so as mentioned, I work at Assumption University in Massachusetts now, but prior to working at Assumption, I worked right here down the street at Trinity College in Hartford for 5 years. I created a class that was a math and redistricting class where we talked about some of the math behind this. Math certainly has a role in this process, whether it's, trying to quantify the geometry or the shape of the districts or, the partisan advantage of districts. Or certainly just about like this idea of outliers. We certainly also learn about the politics and the court cases and, things that continue to happen. But yeah, for a few different years, I taught a course that was really just about authentic learning and trying to make the math meaningful, interdisciplinary. And so my students were, and actually I taught this course in fall 2021 when this process was happening in Connecticut. And if you were to go look at at Connecticut's at the webpage that's dedicated for the last redistricting process, you'll see a lot of the public testimony submissions were from my students because I wanted them to be involved and actively like a part of the process and not just learning about it, but actually participating in the civic process. And so, my students learned about, all the different mathematical approaches, the differing opinions from both sides and, had them construct their own maps. Using these online tools, right, that have all the census data built in and different ways to check and come up with your own definition of what is fair or why should it be this way. And so really, I think just incredibly rewarding for myself, but especially for the students to, learn this from all the different angles, from a mathematical lens, from a legal lens, from a political lens, and really try to put all those different ideas together and create their own maps and participate in the process.
Really cool descent into democracy, sort of, because in researching the topic for this show, you could see that testimony online from in the redistricting part in 2021. As I understand it, one of your students said that they used to think that if a district looks weird, it's got to be gerrymandered, right? And if it doesn't, it's fair. What did your class reveal about why it's actually more complicated than that, or some kind of assumptions that were tested?
Yeah, certainly. So I think it's always fun to kind of just look at the eye test, right? And people do this all the time. And, you could post these funny things and look at this shape. This looks like whatever character or image. But certainly, just because it might fail the eye test, so to speak, doesn't mean it's unfair or gerrymandered in some sort of way. There's a lot more that meets the eye. The reverse is also true, by the way. Just because it's a nice looking shape doesn't mean it wasn't a victim of gerrymandering, right? But there's certainly so many more considerations. You could have a nice square looking shape, but maybe there's a mountain right in between them. I mean, we don't have that problem in Connecticut, but in some of the Western states, you certainly would have questions of geography that would impact this. But more importantly, wherever you are, you're going to have questions of communities, right? And so in redistricting and gerrymandering, we talk a lot about the idea of communities of interest. And, one of those examples certainly is racial and ethnic minority groups, but it doesn't have to be, right? I think one of the examples I think of in Connecticut is, the marine industry, and maybe somewhere down in New London and Groton. And there could be a very valid reason for those people to be districted together because they would want a representative that best serves their needs. And so, maybe it would create a semi-funny looking shape, but it could be done for very legitimate reasons.
Great conversation thus far, talking about national politics and what's happened with Supreme Court ruling. And now we've been able to give you a sense of what's happening in Connecticut in terms of redistricting here in our history and how it's done. We'd like you to participate in the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. After the break, we dig deeper into how the redistricting frenzy rippling across the nation could impact midterm elections. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. A recent Supreme Court ruling undercutting a key part of the Voting Rights Act could have major implications for how political maps are drawn across the country. Now attention is turning to states, including Connecticut. Still with us is Bilal Sekou, the Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford, and Kyle Evans, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at Assumption University. And before we dive in, a note for our listeners, next week we'll be talking with the state's new child advocate, Christina Guillo, about some of the legislation that passed in 2026 to protect children. Make sure you stay tuned into that. Now let's dive back into redistricting. And if you want to give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Be quick if you're going to call us because we're almost done. We only got about 6 or 7 minutes left. So we've been talking a lot about congressional maps, but these rules apply more broadly, right? So how does redistricting play out in things like state legislative districts, city councils, even school boards?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to talk about this from a town level as well, and I think it's a natural question when you start with the congressional districts and then you keep zooming in, right? So you zoom into getting smaller and smaller districts. And, of course, we have the 169 towns here in Connecticut. And this was actually a project that I worked on with a student at Trinity in my time there, a student by the name of Julietta Natito. And we were really interested in kind of documenting all the different town level processes. So, and we had found that over 30 towns in Connecticut have a need to redistrict within their towns, right? So this is independent of the state level maps. And I say this, and I want to clarify that, of course, every town is going to have voting precincts, right? That just says, you live in this part of the town, so you're going to vote at this school or firehouse. But only 30 some odd of the towns actually have these districts. Yeah. Yes, correct. Have these districts in a way that actually affects representation. So what I mean is that, in the majority of the towns, everybody in the town is voting for the same people, regardless of where you live within the town. But there are a handful of towns that, have local districts that actually matter for representation, whether it's their town city council or even if it's the second level of government in some of the towns that have this representative town meeting structure. And so we were really interested in kind of documenting these and kind of putting them in one place. And, kind of finding all these different resources across town websites, and trying to build a database of sorts because we think it's important for these to be accessible to the public and view all these different maps for these different towns and as they were kind of updating it themselves. So admittedly, since I've moved out of Connecticut recently, I haven't been super motivated to update this database, but if anybody is listening and is interested in handing this over, certainly feel free to contact me.
Where do we find the database?
You could just contact. It is on one of my personal website.
Ooh, okay.
So you can find it.
Reach out to Kyle. Yeah.
Reach out. But I'm happy to hand over the reins. And if anybody has a good place to host this and kind of want to update and maintain our town level maps in a place that is accessible, by all means, reach out.
kr.evans@assumption.edu.
There you go. Thank you.
That is the email
that
address.
That is correct.
Hey, I got to ask you a serious question here. So we talk about midterms, but do I have to look beyond with you? Because my question is, we've been having this conversation. Bilal and I talk outside of this world as well. But we've been having this conversation, and even earlier in the show, you alluded that it's, and I'm kind of paraphrasing you here, but so I'm not sure if in the midterms, this is going to be something that benefits black voters, black lawmakers, or even Democrats. It sounds like to you that in order for there to be a paradigm shift in this country or a reckoning on race again here in this country, it might need to be white voters from the South that need to vote Democrat. Is that kind of what I'm getting from you?
Well, I think what, John Meacham wrote a book, The Soul of America. And I think in many ways, this moment we're in is about what is America and what kind of country do we want to live in. I think a couple things to take in mind really quickly. One is that the creation of these opportunity districts, for critics of the use of those districts, their argument was that it also aided in sort of the polarization, the hyperpolarization of our politics, because when you created those districts in the South, it also meant that you created really, really safe Republican districts in many Southern states. And so people criticize at that level. So what's interesting about this decision in getting rid of those districts, if they succeed in doing that, it's no guarantee that this will mean that Republicans will win in every one of those districts, right? So there's this moment for voters throughout the South where this is going to largely play out to really stand up and say, this is not the America we want to be a part of. This is not the way in which our political system should be operating. What is going on is simply wrong, and punish the people who are actually carrying this out.
So the midterm to you is like a nexus point. So like it's either going to be that people are going to stand up and it'll change there, or it's going to take a long time for that paradigm.
It's a moment of clarity for all of us.
And it could backfire in the
It absolutely could backfire for Republicans, because I think if you look at this at the state level, you see a number of Republicans in states that are really reluctant to push what Trump is pushing them to do, because they do in fact worry about what the backlash may be from voters. And they also know that some of those districts are fairly safe districts, and this redistricting may make them a bit less safe. The final thing I'll say, and Kyle was pointing this out about the difference between sort of at-large elections and district sort of based elections. This was also a rich area of battle in the civil rights, era, and continued in the Voting Rights Act certainly was a way of trying to again protect the opportunity for people at the local level to be able to vote, and the opportunity to elect people who really represent their interest and their needs. And so I think it's really appropriate for us to not think about this just at the congressional level, but to understand that even now across the South, there are a lot of communities that do in fact use district level sort of voting, and you may see the impact of this decision at that level too.
Less than a minute for you to do this for me, but with midterm elections on the horizon, what will you be watching? How might this major SCOTUS ruling impact the outcome?
Honestly, I'm going to be looking at competitiveness more than anything else. I think we've seen this across the board, state, local, national, that when different people in charge with certain agendas are creating the maps, that they're usually done to protect a certain interest or party, and usually it results in less competitive elections.
So we'll have to see what happens there. What a fantastic conversation. Bilal Sekou, Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Bilal, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Kyle Evans, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at Assumption University. Kyle, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Go Hounds.
Go Hounds, go Hawks, go Huskies, all the H's. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Patrick Scale. Our technical producer is Eugene Amatruda. Special thanks to Tess Terrible, Megan Fitzgerald, Bradley O'Connor, the rest of our Connecticut Public's visual team and operations team here. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. We're talking to Christine Guillo next week. Tune in to talk about child advocacy with us. Thank you for listening to this week's show.